So yesterday we had started to talk about the idea of population density and the difference between a population that's living like this and a population that's living like that. Now remember, we talked a little bit about some of the risks to living in, which one of those is high density, the top one or the bottom? Or high density? Or higher, yeah. The top is higher density. That bottom one's pretty low density. They're not very crowded. They're very spread out. They've got lots of room. I mean, we could even add a few individuals to that population, and lo and behold, they've still got plenty of room. If we add a few individuals to this one, it's getting kind of rough in there. There's probably a pretty big competition for resources. And, you know, we talked a little bit about how disease spreads. And if we think about these two scenarios living here versus living here. If you're the person who's living here, what are your odds of contracting a disease from another person? A whole lot lower than they are if you're living here in a very crowded area, in a high density region. So if we then think back to the film, the Crash Course Population Ecology movie. So he was talking about factors that limit population growth. What do we call those? In the film, he was talking about factors that limit the growth of a population. What do we call those factors that limit the growth of a population? Yeah, limiting factors. And what species was he talking about in the film? Mosquitoes. Mosquitoes in Dallas, Texas. And specifically because they spread disease. What was the disease, do you remember?
I was
Not parvo.
Yeah, I don't know why.
It's mosquito-borne illness. Not Zika. Zika's the one we talked about. That's a contemporary issue. No, that's Zika. West Nile virus. Okay? And he was talking about the outbreak that happened in Dallas in 2012. So, okay, so he was talking about how the mosquito population boomed in 2012, right? Mosquitoes just took off. What does that mean? So he actually said, he quoted a statistic. He said that the mosquito growth rate was, we're going to say, it was basically 1,000. So at the beginning of a 2-week period, for every one mosquito that was alive at the beginning of that period, there are 1,000 mosquitoes alive at the end of that period. What kind of growth is that? What do we call that kind of growth? There's a word we've used for that kind of growth. What was that kind of growth? If we graphed it, it would look something like, yeah, exponential growth. So if we graphed it, it's going to be this crazy line like that. When a population is growing exponentially, what's limiting their growth? Think back to the rats in Rat Attack. During the period when they're growing exponentially, when the bamboo fruit is in, life is good. Lots of calories for everybody. Seriously, what's limiting their growth? Nothing. So yeah, that was the answer, I know. It sounds like, she can't really want us to say nothing. No, nothing is limiting their growth. It's through the roof. It is a party. Mosquito party. Big breeding clouds. Woohoo! Babies for everybody. Blood for all. Seriously. Okay. Blood for all. Tell me it was video. In that circumstance, nothing's limiting their growth. It's a free-for-all. In exponential growth, remember, there are no limiting factors. So in the film, he said, well, the limiting factors start to kick in some years. In 2011, the mosquitoes weren't having a great year. Their population didn't boom. They weren't growing exponentially. So when limiting factors start to kick in, they are one of two types. They can either be density independent or density dependent. So we're going to talk about these real quick. Okay, so these are fairly intuitive. You're all, you have fine brains between your ears. You can figure it out. Density independent means it doesn't depend on density. And when he was talking about the mosquitoes growing in Dallas in the summer of 2012, when we said, what's limiting their growth? Nothing. Everything is going their way. Have you ever had a day like that where everything was just going your way? Like, everything worked. You hit a home run. You scored whatever. You baked a cake and it was perfect. I don't know what you did. You got an A on your test. Your puppy didn't pee in your bedroom overnight. Whatever. Everything worked. That's the kind of year mosquitoes were having in 2012. So there are things that could have limited their growth. What did he say made it such a great year for them? There were a couple big things he said. So there was no shortage of food because what do mosquitoes like to eat to reproduce? Blood. Human blood is preferable. They really like human blood. You're tasty. Plenty of food. What other factors affected those mosquitoes in 2012? What other factors affected those mosquitoes? Are there a lot of mosquitoes out today?
No, there's not because of the weather.
Mosquitoes like it hot. They like to breed and reproduce and grow in warm water. Warm, stagnant water is perfect. So the weather plays a big factor. And the summer of 2012 in Dallas was hot. And their babies live in little tiny pools of water. And if you get big storms, remember he said you'll wash out all those mosquito larvae. They need stagnant water, like old buckets and cans and little tiny things that hold water. Clogged up gutters are a great place for mosquitoes to breed. Old tires, things that'll hold just a little bit of water. Yeah.
I've seen clouds of mosquitoes.
Well, the larvae are in the water. The larvae are in the water. So they need stagnant water. The adults are in the air. He said the summer of 2012 was hot and dry. They didn't have a lot of rainstorms that washed out all those larvae. So the weather was in their favor. There were no big natural disasters. No fire swept through and dried up the puddles or boiled the puddles that the baby mosquitoes were living in and cooked them all. There was no hurricane that came through and flushed them all out of the stagnant water they were in. So these things all lined up in their favor. And on top of that, there was plenty of food. Because the weather was good, there was plenty of territory and nest sites. They had lots of little puddles. There were no diseases that swept through the mosquito population. Mosquitoes can get diseases too. Anything can get a disease. Nothing like that affected them. There were enough humans, they weren't having to compete for blood. Life was good. So when we think about that growth model, as a population is growing exponentially, nothing is limiting their growth. And then it comes to a point where suddenly you get to a certain point and what starts to happen? Yeah, you start to taper off. And it tends to start to level out. What do we call this? It's fluctuating, easy for me to say. It's fluctuating around what? What does that red line represent? That red line is how many individuals the environment can support over the long term. Well, it is an average of sorts, but it's got a very specific name. Number of individuals the environment can carry. Carrying capacity. So in the summer of 2012 in Dallas, mosquitoes had not reached the carrying capacity. They didn't have a population crash. They were doing well. So factors like weather and hurricanes and tornadoes, fires that sweep through and kill a bunch of animals, it doesn't matter how many individuals there are, it affects them equally. So if we look at a graph like this, something like a flood that wipes out every single mosquito there, it doesn't matter if there are 100 mosquitoes or 10,000 mosquitoes. A flood's going to kill most of them. Doesn't matter how dense the population is, doesn't matter how many there are. But if we think about something like how much food's available. I had a prof in college, Dr. David McLean, and he was an entomologist. He's somebody who studies bugs, and his specialty was biting black flies. Has anybody here ever been to Canada, or northern Minnesota? His wife was from Minnesota. They actually retired up there. There are these little insects. You think mosquitoes are bad? Biting black flies are about 1 billion times worse. They're like deer fly bites. And McLean talked about doing field work, and he was a bug geek. This man was passionate about insects. He loved insects. He was awesome. He talked about going to field sites out in the middle of nowhere. So, picture it much, much wetter, but basically the same kind of human population as we see here. No humans living there, except this is a wetland in Minnesota, not a lovely grassland desert out somewhere in the west. But no people live there. So the black flies are feeding on deer, foxes. They have wolves up in northern Minnesota. Other vertebrate, other mammal species. But they're consuming all the blood they can. He talked about sites where the bugs were so hungry that when they pulled the car up, the minute you turned off the engine and stopped the vehicle, you would hear, and it was the biting black flies hitting the windows. Because if you had the windows even cracked, they were coming through. And the minute you got out, if you were not wearing full body bug nets, your face would be covered, your hands would be covered, every part of your body that wasn't covered in clothing would be covered in little biting black flies. And you were doing this the entire time, which makes it really hard to concentrate on anything. Ah! Just the thought of it makes me insane. Those insects did not have enough food. They were at their carrying capacity. They were using all the food they could. When new food arrives, because guess what, baby? You pull up in a swamp in northern Minnesota, you are fresh blood. Woohoo! And you're the site of the next party. Yeah. So they were living at carrying capacity. When you introduce a little bit more food, they take advantage of it. Those kind of factors, like competition for food, those start to control the population when you get up to carrying capacity. And maybe on a year when you had a lot of tourists to an area where they were already using the available food, you get a spike in the population. And then on a year when a lot of mammals die, you get a low point in the population. But on average, it fluctuates around that carrying capacity. So those density-dependent factors are the ones that really kick in when you get up close to the carrying capacity. So those density-dependent factors kick in when you approach carrying capacity. And then they start to regulate the carrying capacity of the population. So what we are going to do next is we're going to head over to PBWorks. And on PBWorks, you're going to find a link to a population model. It's a case study of a population of lions in a very specific location in Africa, because remember, if we're talking about population, we have to include two pieces of information. What are they? The species and the location. And you're going to walk through this population simulation with me, or on your own. It is 20 slides, and on each slide there's a question. Okay? You can also get to it through Classroom, whichever one you want. Because what I've discovered is that the model software does not track your responses. On every single slide, you're going to put in your answer, hit check my answer, and then screenshot it. So you'll have 20 images, 20 screenshots, and when you're all done, you'll pop those into a Google Slides presentation, 1 image per slide, and you'll submit it to me through Classroom so that I know you did it. You're going to get 20 points for it. If you miss a slide, you lose a point for it. If you forget to screenshot a slide, you need to go back and pick it up, finish it, because it will not let you go back.
Wait, so
You can't use the back button. Huh?
You hit the answer and screenshot it?
Yep, hit the answer, hit check your answer, and then screenshot. So let me walk you through one. So this is what you're starting on. You'll just go ahead and hit launch the activity. Like I said, screenshot after every single answer, and hit check your answer. And if you're not getting it right, it will make you go back until you do. So.
Screenshot it after you check answer.
Yep, after you hit check answer. And that shows me, like, yeah, you got the right answer. So, and I'll float around and help you if you're stuck on any of them. These will be due tomorrow by the time you walk in. So if you don't get it done today, you can do it during the day tomorrow. That's where we'll wrap up. If you happen to look at PB Works also, I know at least a few of you did, because we're cutting the last part of this chapter, we're actually going to have a unit quiz on this material next Tuesday. So you'll get your study guides Friday, and they will be due end of the day. I'm sure you guys will be basically end of the period. And I can give you those study guides in the morning if anybody wants, so you can get started on it if you don't think you can. Thursday. Thursday. Yep. Bingo. Screenshot it right there. And then I'll give you the key for the study guide Monday. You can do your video study guides, and your quiz will be Tuesday. Questions, comments, concerns? Okay, I'm going to